Welcome back to another episode of Quants Worth Following. Today, we have special guest Marco Jean Aboav with us. He's a seasoned quantitative finance expert with 2 decades of experience spanning quant finance in both academia and industry. He holds a PhD in quant finance, has worked as a quant researcher, and today he runs Etna Research, which is a financial AI firm focused on alpha discovery, leveraging frontier models. In addition, Marco continues his involvement in academia as an associate professor of financial technology. So, Marco, after receiving your PhD, you started your career as a portfolio quant strategist at Citi. So, curious about what made you decide to go into the industry versus staying in academia. And was it a difficult decision for you at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed my PhD days, but at the same time, when there is this kind of inner force that is pushing you to, I was in London, finished my PhD there. I was visiting a PhD student in London. So everything was happening around me. And it was just too difficult to be far away from the action. So it was an easy decision. And at the same time, I think after the PhD, I guess when you're a little bit more entrepreneurial, combining your academic background in the industry is actually a very interesting combo at the time and still enjoying. So far it seems it's a good decision.
Amazing. I'm so glad to hear that. Your PhD research was on systematic investment strategies. And I feel like that was fairly rare, especially back then. So I get this question a lot, especially from students today, which is what are some of the differences between a quant academic versus a quant practitioner?
Well, two, objective function. One is producing great papers. The second is to, if you are in systematic strategies, to make P&L or with decent risk. So obviously the end goal is totally different and the attention to details is very different. One is very focused on, I would say, very, very low engineering infrastructure to write a paper versus something which has a much more complex management to achieve the result. So in my experience, it's really like a totally different engineering goal within the main goal of your systematic business versus the academic, which is really, writing great papers and getting published. So the objective function makes the difference. Sure.
Awesome. Curious, are there any lessons that a quant academic could learn from a quant practitioner and vice versa?
Well, most of the people that I know in academia, they're pretty good. Typically, I've always had some, you know, short to mid-term, medium period in the industry because it gives you a little bit kind of the grip of what's going on. So definitely could help, but also vice versa is true. So what academia gives you, especially if you've been through a PhD journey, is to really being, obsessed by solving your specific problem. And this is something that, especially when you're in the industry at the beginning, you don't have so much time. You always need to deliver, right? You have 2 weeks to do this project. Fantastic. But if you really want to go deeper, it takes a lot of time. So I wouldn't say that I should use always the same academic approach in the industry, but learning how to do it properly a few times gives you a sense about how really you need to go deeper when you actually then apply this kind of skill set to the industry.
That's fantastic advice. And I guess expanding broader upon that, what career advice would you give to students who are trying to break into the quant trading field today? And would you advise them to pursue a PhD?
Well, I guess that the big difference compared when I finished, everybody was at the time using MATLAB and very basic understanding of computer science, I would say. Today, you really need to master different fields. Doesn't matter if you are in the high frequency, mid frequency, low frequency, on pricing, you need that kind of combination that before was really like at the beginning of all these big trends. So I think this is the major aspect. And it's fascinating because it's a little bit more complex, but it's much more fascinating because it's really a combination of science and computer engineering. And coming to your second point about is it still worth it? The beauty, I guess, of a background in science and engineering is always that you can apply to financial markets and finance in general, is you can apply it to even like a new different entrepreneurial activity. So I think there is much broader opportunities than just being, on a front office investment team running strategy. So there is much more than that. And I think even like with my company, exactly, I wanted to expand what I learned to something which is much broader.
Absolutely. And speaking of which, what are some of the most underrated skills, do you think, for a quant to have today?
This is something that I keep receiving emails, keep receiving questions about it. I was so tired of receiving all these things that in the end, I create a wiki, which is completely open for everyone who wants to be a financial data scientist. For instance, obviously, again, much more into the statistical, let's say, path, right? Not necessarily the pricing path, is really master the computer science side, because I think it's the way to really control your destiny. No matter if you're going to do specific, HFT or buy side, sell side, is really the key component, because that's kind of the way to really optimize your work. And also, if you combine with everything that is happening, like in the generative AI, you still need to understand how computer science is designed to excel, right? So I think that was, again, the underrated subject in the past. Today is even more important. There is no compromise now. Before was accepted.
Yeah, for sure. We definitely noticed that the same trend in this space as well. And you're right, as the industry is growing, it's important to, grasp true knowledge of CS, right? And you can't just be skimming the field anymore. I think having a deeper understanding, you're right, it gives you so much of an upper edge now in this space. So absolutely. And on the lines of that as well, what's one common career mistake that you see younger quants make these days?
Well, I guess again, coming back to the typical problem is that you always jump on modeling. I always say that, when people talk about AI, machine learning, it's all about the data. The thing is, you need to be the real expert on data, and then the rest is some kind of a second or third derivative effect. It doesn't really matter if you are very good in models if you don't understand the data behind the scene, right? And I've seen too many people always jumping on the fancy stuff and not mastering, the basic. And if you remember, what Jim Simon was saying, it's all about Y and X. And you can be very creative in the way you design the relationship between Y and X, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily need very complex mapping, which might come from very fancy models, because you first need to understand where X is coming, where Y is coming. So I think the typical issue that the young folks get into, and they stick to it very for too much time before realizing that there's much more than that.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I guess diving into a different hat now, talking more about the quant finance field and more about your background, how do you see the role of traditional quantitative models evolving in the age of machine learning and AI today?
Yeah, I mean, the funny story is that my PhD thesis was on regime switching, time varying relationship, and so on, and still today is still relevant. And now sometimes they get rebranded into something fancy using the most advanced whatever machine learning models, but the reality is that adding complexity goes back to my original point about you really to understand the engineering side to deal with these models, because they bring much more engineering complexity than a basic, couple of moving averages to do CTA, right? It's a completely different paradigm difference. And so that's very important to me, that it's always neglected because people want to jump on the models. But then I always say, good luck with your ML ops, good luck with your AI ops, because it's just going to be a mess. So play as safe as possible every time and understanding the engineering implication of whatever you do, because then you're not going to see anything in production if you always chase for the fancy stuff as the first principle.
Amen to that. Yeah, we've noticed the exact same thing even in our work as well. When you chase after too many shiny objects, too many pieces of hardware bloat, software bloat as well. And, you start to lose direction on what you're doing and the quality of what you're building as well. So, yeah, absolutely. Among the many roles you've had, you were a global macro portfolio manager at Newman Capital. So, Putting on your global macro hat, how are macroeconomic trends today, like inflation and geopolitical activity, changing how quants approach modeling?
I would say that this risk has always been there, even in the old days. The difference is that today, all these external, or I would say external drivers, can be measured somehow. Now, it's not as straightforward as looking at prices, but it can be measured. So it becomes like a toolkit for people that actually look at macro markets, from futures, CDS, ETF stocks, credit. So it's actually possible to track them. It doesn't mean it's going to be easier because, again, think about what happened in the last 2, 3 months, and how policy flipping is. It's really one Twitter away, one message away for having your P&L completely upside down. So the reality is, yes, it's much easier to measure, but it doesn't mean you're going to have positive impact on the way you actually designing your systems. And so that's, to me, one aspect. So yes, measurable, not sure about effectiveness necessarily. And in fact, if you look at the best discretionary guys, they look at prices and they just make an assessment on politics. And they're good. They can be very good. And I work with lots of very good quants and good discretionary people, and they get it both ways with different lenses, but they can measure and capture that. But still, again, the difference now is that is available. So you can measure things, anything really, proxy via proxies, but still it's good enough. But then it's good enough and it's going to have an impact on your P&L? Questionable, I guess. At least that's in my experience.
Yeah, that would be nice if it had a positive impact for everyone, but unfortunately, that's very much not the reality today. Moving on to the next question. Among the many hats you wear, you're also an associate professor in financial technology at Base Business School. From your perspective, what skills should students learn to prepare themselves for this new wave of innovation and, I guess, volatility in the quant trading industry today?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, it's always being focused on executive education, less in the bachelor's or master these days, because I'm much more entrepreneur. I have much less time to do all of these kind of things. But it's actually interesting because when you study the evolution of financial technology, and similar also to your business, the consumerization of enterprise in the enterprise landscape is very interesting because it's really changing how people think, and they wanted desperately to get this. It was clear in the industry. So if you really see these mega trends that are happening in the fintech side, which is just, composability, consumerization within the enterprise environment, data, any type of data landscape and data ingestion and so on. So there are so many beautiful businesses that they shine. If you think from a credit perspective, from a public market perspective, private assets and so on. So I was very curious. At the time, fintech 10 years ago was something that was not even like a position, right? But nowadays, again, coming back to, if you combine business with engineering and finance, create this kind of triangle of skills and interesting businesses that can be addressed with a proper, I would say, quantitative mind, because the common path is always have this kind of quantitative background to really address these new businesses. And again, the implication, just if you think about financial markets, is just huge, right? So we see from Gen I is really bringing a new set of businesses that were not there before, but also a transformation within the current organization, because we have been used to market, trading floors that are less crowded than before. But this is going to be massive. It's going to be and it's not me saying this, but it's, the CEO of Anthropic claiming this many times. And I see the same trend as well in our vertical. So it's real.
Yeah, it really is. And I guess a couple of final questions for you. I'm curious on what's your take on the surge in retail trading and the democratization of financial data and tools in the last couple of years or so?
Yeah, I mean, the democratization is always a wonderful word that is being used to sell new stuff, right? Or to move the risk from one side to the other. So yes, it's cheaper. Yes, you have tools, but are you really competing with the other side or the institutional side? So that, I think, to me is questionable. Great business if you think about Robinhood, but then it's questionable if you actually have a positive outcome to the masses. You might have, you might not have, but the thing is, again, if you understand the incentive, you understand the outcomes of things, right? So definitely you can, again, map, measure, summarize great things that was not possible 4 or 5 years ago. The reality is that, yes, you have less cost to trade and so on, but if you invest, 60/40 is still shining out there. So are you really going to compete with that? And from a tax perspective, so there is a lot of, inner details that, again, sometimes get neglected, but I agree, it's much easier, it's much measurable, everything. And so definitely is a great way for, I would say, a small group of people out there that can capitalize on this. But again, on the average Joe, with all these things out there, it's unclear from my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a common saying in the industry, if a product is free, you are the product then. And for Facebook and Twitter, that's very much the case. And same with products like maybe Robinhood and any kind of free service. If you're using the free tier, then your data is probably being used in one way or another. So, that's the reality of life, I guess. um, yeah. Marco, actually, I'm curious, do you have about an extra 10 minutes or so? Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Listen.
Perfect. Okay, great. So I guess I'll just ask a couple final questions if that's okay, and then we can go from there. So I'm curious now, how do you see the future of structured finance evolving in the face of AI, decentralized finance, and open data?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the last big trends was, pre-OH, mega complexity wrapped into something which is difficult to understand. Then we got the anti-complexity cycle where it was all about access, execution algorithms, right? Until a few years ago. And then now we are at the stage where, hey, we have a genius in the bottle that is out there and it could do many different things for you. And you just need to prompt stuff. So structure finance, or in general, anything that has to deal with customization, layering, allows you to actually customize on the fly things for investors. So definitely is a trend that is going to stay because you have the tools. Again, I mentioned the genius in the bottle that is out there and you just prompt and you get something. It is going to become much more complex. In fact, even with my firm, we actually do exactly this. So we combine the complexity of running certain type of QIS primitives with the customization on the fly of an AI agents. So if you combine these two things, structuring is going to be the game because everybody could buy a fund, right? But customization is a completely different problem. And I think we are still early, but the tools, the technologies now is there. So it's going to be fast, right? Lots of people are working on this. And again, the do it yourself or institutional and layering and so on is going to be much easier because the ecosystem allows you to do that. You think if you just about managed accounts technology is out there and you don't need a fund. You just need a managed account technology to measure risk much better instead of allocating capital these days. So then is another story if the manager is happy to do that, but it's possible. So there is a lot of, again, on the structured finance side, and structuring in general, I would say, is the key game for the next 2 3 years, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And I can definitely see that given what's been happening in the last few years or so. Yeah. And so, for a couple final questions, looking forward, can you talk more about your company, Etna Research, and what are you currently working on? And also, what are you currently excited about?
Yeah, I mean, the starting point of Etna was really how to avoid the mistakes I did before and what I learned about the friction of the industry. And I basically wrapped with my business partner, that is actually my former boss, how to really give the primitives to firms that have the money and they want to customize and do innovation fast. So, in a nutshell, what it means is think about QIS. It's kind of QIS on steroids, but I give you the primitives to run your own QIS. Now, this is part A. Part B is like, okay, pre-GPT was all about, okay, I'm going to meet people, selling what we do, coming to New York, going to London, going to Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and so on. Fine. With all the agents side, now you can actually have Marco 10,000 time out there working on pre-sales, sales engineering 24/7. And it could build on the fly for you, just talking to my avatar in a way, potentially, or just prompting is fine, to build solution on the fly. So this is really coming back to my point about the big trend is customization, but customization is hard to do it. And you want always quality with customization. I mean, I forgot the first part, right? You can create basket, but you want to create useful basket. And the second is like, how I'm going to pitch my useful baskets? Well, agents allows you to do this on steroids, which again is more kind of to create a distribution advantage of what we do. And what makes it exciting is like, well, this is like the summary of a few things I've seen in the industry. Doing proper engineering infrastructure is hard, as you know. So that was my first goal, to build a foundation, causal AI, continual learning, all these nice things. You have to find, the engineering angle to make them work. So that was the first. It's always kind of makes it exciting because it's like building a Ferrari behind the scene. But the second is really about the fact that with AI agents these days, and with a lot of knowledge coming from the heuristics of being in the industry for a long time, you can do great things. And again, is really the disruption that we have seen, the big people, right? The complexity and algorithmization 2024, and now agentification 2024 and beyond. So that's really the pivot time. So it's definitely exciting, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just one final question. What's a bold prediction that you have for the future of finance?
I think it's becoming even more automated from different perspectives. So the services are going to be instantaneous. There is much more automation pretty much everywhere. You don't need to be in New York. You don't need to be in London. In fact, for instance, we have a remote team and we work as when I was in London, same time when I was on a trading floor of 20 people. It's the same now. We're just on Slack or on call all the time. So it's the beauty is that there is much more room to create new fintech services. So it's an ecosystem. In order to survive, you don't need thousands of partners, but you need a decent number of good partners.
Yeah.
So the opportunities there are massive because no matter if you are an huge incumbent or mid company or professional traders, there is much more opportunities these days. The thing is, I feel that the opportunity is much more on the entrepreneurial side and less in the corporate traditional financial path of starting as an analyst and, you go become an MD. I think it's shifting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Marco, for your time today. I really appreciate all the questions, and especially coming from such a rare background of having both academia and getting a PhD in the space, as well as working in the industry and also having a current position in the industry, both academically as well as entrepreneurially. So it's been a pleasure to have you today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day ahead of them. So yeah, take care, guys.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah,
Thank you
thank
very
you.
much.
Bye.